Hey guys, welcome to The Grey Escape. I'm Natalie Gray, and it's time for part 2 of our tasty chat with author and researcher Anthony Peake. I'll tell you more about it right after this. If you need to send money overseas and transfer currencies, go to thegreyescape.com/cash. Learn how you can save up to 90% on international money transfer fees and get the best currency conversion rates, even beating out companies like PayPal. And the best thing is, you get a transfer for free. That's right, just for listening to this show, you get to do a totally free international money transfer. So head on over to thegreyescape.com/cash. Okay, it's time for part 2 of our conversation with British writer and researcher Anthony Peake, leading expert on fringe areas of human consciousness, author of the brand new book, Opening the Doors of Perception. This is a juicy one, folks, as Anthony gives us the nuts and bolts of just how we might all be computer simulations. So sit back and enjoy. It's the holographic man himself, continuing from right where we left off in part 1. Here's Anthony Peake. I've got another thing to bring up because you say about Tesla. So in your book, you're talking about the synapses in the brain, which is very fascinating stuff. Because the little bits and bobs in your brain, they don't actually connect. There's these tiny, tiny gaps between them that are like a millionth of a centimetre. They're so tiny. And in your book, you explain that the connections occur with a combination of chemistry and electricity. So I was pondering, where does the electricity come from? And it did cross my mind because Nikola Tesla, one of his whole things was that we are in a grid of electricity, and this is how we can power the entire planet. So are our organic bodies not already connecting quite efficiently to this electrical grid?
Well, we create electricity inside ourselves all the time.
How?
I guess in the same way that normal electricity is generated, but you have me thinking now as to how that happens, because there is an associate of mine, another name coming out here, called Istvan Bokken. And Istvan is a professor of physics at, I think, the University of Budapest. And he is an expert on biophotons. And biophotons are electromagnetic energy, which is electricity.
Like pieces of the sun, right, is a biophoton.
Yeah.
Like little pieces of light, basically.
Well, the pieces of light, and of course, and electrons and photons and everything else. So that little pieces of light that are actually generated by the body itself. And of course, one could argue that the microtubules may be creating biophotons as well, because they fire, because of the way they create photons and they cause these interference patterns, they are creating electromagnetic energy in exactly the same way. Because of course, light and energy, light and electricity are just the elements of the same thing. You know, electricity is just a stream of electrons, and light is carried. Electromagnetic energy is carried by photons. They are the carriers of the electromagnetic charge. So where we draw this up from is intriguing, because, you know, we can draw it from inside ourselves. We can draw it from within the field. Do we draw it from something called the 0 point field? And the 0 point is a form of 0 point energy, is a form of energy that exists where energy should not exist. It exists on just above literally absolute zero. And of course, the whole definition of absolute zero is there's no energy.
I still can't get my head around this. I've heard this phrase by people like Greg Braden, and I'm always a little bit confused to grasp it, the 0 point field. Okay.
0 point energy. If you take anything and you take it down to minus 217.72 degrees, all energy stops.
I see. So you freeze it to bits.
You freeze it to bits. And what energy is, all energy is electrons moving. and subatomic particles moving. If they stop, they can't move anymore.
Got it.
So they have no energy.
Got it.
Now, what they can do is, I think it's helium-8, can be taken down to literally within a billionth of a degree of absolute zero, where there should be no energy coming up, but there is energy. Okay. Now, the other thing about zero point energy, and it's going to get a bit technical, but it makes sense. There is something called I think it's the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And that is that you can never know the location or velocity of an object. You can't know both. You can either know where it is or how fast it's moving, or whether it's moving, but you can't know both. It's one of the rules of quantum physics. It's mathematical, and there's all kinds of esoteric reasons.
How do airports work?
And one of the things that they say, and without going into technical details, is that there are certain effects that are impossible to take place, whereby you can actually borrow energy where there isn't any energy, once you only borrow it for a very, very small amount of time. It sounds crazy, and it's in contravention of all rules of normal big physics, but apparently you can. And they'll turn around and they say, you can actually borrow energy from the universe. And this again suggests that there is this kind of energy force. Now, is this energy force dark energy that we talk about a great deal? Is this energy force to do with dark matter? Because, as you know, we have discovered that there's something very peculiar with galaxies. I don't know if you understand why people believe in dark energy.
I mean, isn't dark energy also where they thought that there was a vacuum, but now they found there is energetic activity?
Well, no, that's 0 point energy as well.
That's 0 point.
No, the dark energy and dark matter is something even more curious.
Okay.
If you spin something, I don't know, spin water or something, the speed of the bits further out will be, and I never get this right, whether it's slower or faster, and people can correct me which one I've got this right, but the principle is still the same. There is a certain law of when something's spinning, the further out it is, it spins faster.
It'd be faster, right?
Yeah, so faster. And it's to do with the mass of the object, how it spins. When they look at galaxies, kind of whirlpool galaxies, they're spinning as if there's far more matter in them. Like 94% of the matter is missing. If you add 94% more matter, you then get the mathematics so the galaxies spin in the right way. And so they know that 94% of something is missing. And they don't know what it is, so they call it dark energy, dark matter. But there's also this form of energy, which is probably 0 point energy, which is another 4%, I think, an additional bit that's missing. But suffice to say, most of the universe we can't see, we can't detect, we have no way of knowing what it is, both in terms of energy and in terms of matter. So there is something out there we don't know of. And because we don't know, we just call it dark. And it's simple as that. Now, if this is a simulation, this may explain why these oddities take place. Is this the energy that keeps the simulation going? Because in 2008, there is some, I think, was it 2008? I can't remember. It was a few years ago anyway. There is something called the GEO 8000 gravity wave detector in southern Germany. And what they're trying to do is to find gravity waves. The idea is that because gravity is a force, it should wave. There should be waves of gravity in exactly the same way as there are waves of electromagnetic energy. So they're trying to detect it. So far as I'm aware, I don't think they've found gravity waves yet, because if they find gravity waves, they'll find something called a graviton, which is the force carrier of the gravity waves, because this is what the Higgs boson was all about. The Higgs boson was something that carries force. Okay, a photon is a boson. It's something that carries force. Okay, and they failed to find these, but there was something else they found, and I've tried to read it, and when I read it and I immediately understand it, and then I forget it again. But it's something to do with how the energy of the universe works in terms of detection. And they found something that mathematically matched to some ridiculously small number what they would expect to find if the universe was a simulation. Okay, there's a guy called Craig Hogan. If anybody's interested in checking up on this for me and interest yourself. It's a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute that's doing a lot of this work. But they then started looking at black holes. And black holes are quite strange because they're supposed to suck everything in. Nothing escapes from a black hole. But they have discovered mathematically, and I think they've discovered by detection, something called Hawking radiation, which is something that's given off by black holes, which means that black holes will lose energy.
They're leaking.
They're leaking. Now, on top of this, one of the laws of science, I think it's the second law of thermodynamics, you can never lose information.
It has to go somewhere.
It has to go somewhere. So if I picked up your laptop and threw it into a black hole, all the information on that black hole, all the information on that laptop would be lost, which is impossible in an enclosed universe. You can't lose things in an enclosed universe. It can only be changed into something else.
Right.
So what they've come to the conclusion is that the edge of a black hole, I think it's the Schwarzschild radius, it may be, I'm not sure, it's the event horizon maybe, but along that is smeared the information of everything that falls into the black hole, and it's smeared in a two-dimensional strip. And they're now coming to conclude that the whole of the universe, the universe from the Big Bang is expanding out like a huge sphere. The edge of the sphere of the universe as it's expanding is peppered with tiny Planck squares. Now, the Planck length is the smallest known size that you can possibly be. It's something ridiculously small. And each of these little squares contain one digit of information.
Whoa.
A 0 or a 1. And these things are beaming in information into the universe, which means that this whole universe is a hologram. Now, again, before people think, and they're going, oh, this is too far, this is crazy, just go and get hold of, I think it was 2008, Scientific American, and on the front cover, it's got the whole story written by a guy called Jacob Bekenstein, who is at one of the Israel universities. This is hard science, and it's the biggest part of science. So if this is digital, this is our simulation.
I mean, I don't know if you remember, because it's been a while since we had our last interview, but you know what I saw, which is why I've had this huge as well interest in any information about holographic universe. They say when people have near-death experiences, there's always this white light. Maybe they see angels or relatives. For me, I saw a flawless lattice of energy balls. And I had no science background in this. I hadn't met a you at this point that I would have any latent information circulating in my brain. I mean, I can see them now all set against black, like an outer space thing. Beautiful energy balls with a light green halo, and they were in a lattice grid so flawlessly aligned that I remember at the time being literally crossing my mind, this has to have been done by a software program. How could it be so perfect, these energy balls? And that led me to, afterwards, I was looking up anything with the word lattice, which one of your guys, this, is it Kluver that you mentioned in the book?
Cliverform constants. Yeah.
And he's one of the first people that I've come up with, thanks to your book, who's talked about people seeing geometric patterns. Because I couldn't find a lot of information on the internet of people seeing geometric patterns. And what was especially strange with what I saw, I didn't feel any fear, but my own body disappeared. So I was in this world of this lattice grid of energy balls, but I could look over my shoulder and see the two people in the room with me and talk to them and tell them what I was seeing. Even though I couldn't see my own body, if I turned my head, I would see them, I mean, we have one witness sat right here in this room, so thank God I had two people with me, as I'd never be able to tell anybody because it sounds so crazy, but this really happened. So when I was researching so diligently, like lattices, illusion, holographic, I came up with crystals, which have this perfect lattice of molecules that form crystals. Some of them are on a parallel, like a parallelogram, and some of them are cubic, which is what I saw, was a cubic lattice. So yeah, that would feed into this simulation. And I remember I couldn't discuss it with many people at the time for obvious reasons, because they would think, okay, you've lost it, you've gone crazy. But my brother, thank God, is massively open-minded and spends a lot of time researching himself, a very intelligent guy. And he pointed me in the direction of a few people to listen to who talked about matrices and holographic. And, you know, he was the one who I think even first said to me, well, there's a theory that, and then I found the book, The Holographic Universe, which I have to say I have found debunking of some of the stuff in that already. So, you know, I'm not about believing everything that you read, but I still haven't gotten to the bottom of really what I saw. But boy, would it buy into something like a simulation.
And this is the thing that's so important. You know that what you saw was extraordinary. Critics and skeptics can talk to you till the cows come home. They will say it was an hallucination. They will say all kinds of things. But you know that what you experienced was in fact far more real than this reality. And this is why I'm intrigued by all this, because people have these extraordinary experiences. And my argument is always, okay, guys, had an experience. Where did the light come from? You had, when you were describing it there, you were describing very, very great detail, the light source and the way the light was reflecting off. But this was being generated in the deepest part of your brain, where there is no natural light. But your hallucinatory world, for want of a better term, was illuminated by a form of light that doesn't seem to hurt the eye. It can never be too bright because it's never that, it's intense, but it doesn't hurt the eye, and that's because you're perceiving it without an eye. Because remember, you're perceiving these things without any form of visual stimuli, which is incredible.
I had my eyes open. Like, I was looking with my eyes at this grid and looking over my shoulder at the regular room that I had been in before.
So there was the breakdown. So there was consensual reality, and imposed upon this consensual reality was this overlay of claviform constants.
If I had to say as well, because my own body had disappeared and I just was a point of awareness, the overwhelming sense throughout the entire experience was of great privilege that I was being given a glimpse through the peephole, the keyhole of how the universe really works, and that I was perceiving truth.
Yes.
So if anything, it was that what I was looking at the grid was the truth, and the consensual reality was the hallucinatory overlay. That was more the feeling of it, was the curtain being lifted.
And that is reported so many times, where people who take dimethyltryptamine, for instance, will, as soon as they are in the space of dimethyltryptamine and the hallucination of dimethyltryptamine, they come back and realize this is the hallucination. This is the mind-forged manacles.
Yeah.
This is the illusion. This is the matrix we're existing within. And when we go into altered states of consciousness, when our doors of perception are opened, we see the reality, as Blake said, as it really is. I'm reminded, and I cite this, do you know the myth of Plato's cave?
No.
Okay, Plato came up with this, 2000 BC, something like this. He said, imagine a scenario that there are a group of men that from the time of their birth are chained in a cave, staring at a wall. Okay? And there's 4 or 5 of them, and they're chained, and their heads are in such a way they can only ever look at the wall. Behind them, on a raised platform, is a place where people can walk up and down. And the other side of the raised platform is a fire that's burning. And periodically, people walk along the raised platform with cut-out figures, which reflect onto the wall in front of the tied men.
Like
and
shadows.
They see the shadows. And they watch the shadows, and all their life they've only ever watched the shadows. And they believe that the shadows is all there ever is. One day, one of the prisoners manages to loosen his chains, turns his head round, sees the charade that's going on, walks past to the entrance to the cave, looks out the cave and sees the blue sky and the trees and the sun and the stars, and walks back in again and says to his mates, this is not all there is. It's not all there is. They're just shadows in a cave. And his mates go, don't be ridiculous. And the mates say to each other, so, the shadows are what we see. Just because you've seen some nonsense, you're crazy. You're absolutely mad. We don't even want to talk to you anymore. And that was a philosophy put forward 3,000 years ago. And it's so true now.
Well, this also from your book, your French guy, Henri Bergson, this was another of my little aha moments, because during the experience that I had, I was talking for quite a long time with no ums and ahs. It was just coming through me, and I was speaking of knowledge that I had no conscious knowledge of previously. And one of the things that I was talking about was our bodies are very primitive, and our eyes and our ears are incredibly primitive, that what we see, this hairline of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call visible light, that is what we see. Even on NASA's website, they acknowledge it's the thickness of a soap bubble to what's really there. We are technically blind. That is how limited our vision is, and the same with our hearing. And I had insights I spoke about to do with music, of why music is so universal, that somehow beyond our conscious awareness, music is tapping into something with the frequencies and vibrations. But your man, Henri Bergson, when he said he had the theory that the brain is a limiting device, that again was the information from my experience. Our bodies are like these laptop computers or the transistor radios that are limiting the frequencies that we're perceiving.
Well, and isn't it just hubris to say that our science and the machines we use in order to gauge the reality, raise commas, out there, is gauging all there is? It's arrogance. I'm reminded in 1894, Albert Michelson stood up when he was opening a new part of the University of Chicago. And he turned around and he said, science. At the moment, we know so much about science that future science will spend most of its time calculating the levels of our knowledge to 6 decimal points. There is nothing more really to know.
Wow.
That was in 1894. 6 years later, in December 1900, Max Planck, the German physicist, who, by the way, was working on, when people talk about Max Planck, they don't realize what he was doing. Apparently, in the end of the 19th century, Britain and America were running away with the development of electric lights. And Germany felt they were being left behind. And they needed to develop a new light bulb that would be as effective. And of course, light bulbs generate so much heat, they burn out. So they wanted to find ways of controlling what was called the electromagnetic, the infrared disaster. It's to do with black body radiation and the fact that if there's too much radiation, it bounces around and effectively it will just explode, kind of thing. But they found that on experiments, it didn't happen that way. It didn't go crazy. And the only way that Max Planck could come to the conclusion of why this happened was to say that energy didn't come continually. It came in little chunks or quanta. And he stood up and he made his speech in December 1900, and the world changed, because when Michelson made his statement, he said there were 1 or 2 dark clouds on the horizon, and one of these was this electromagnetic catastrophe, this real problem with black body radiation.
Exploding light bulbs.
To do, ultimately, with exploding light bulbs. He said that the other thing that was problem was to do with the black lines in hydrogen spectra, which they subsequently discovered the reason why that was, because it's really weird with hydrogen or with any kind of spectrum why they have black lines. It's good, a lot of people see them. They think, well, why are they there? Why are there black lines? What do you mean,
black lines?
Well, when you look at a spectrum, when you take the light from I don't know, you burn hydrogen and then you put it through a prism, you will get a rainbow. You get a rainbow effect,
like the Pink Floyd album.
Right?
Exactly.
And you look at that and you look at the spectrum, and there'll be black lines, particularly in hydrogen. There are black lines between the different colours. Whereas the colours just should be continual. There should be one colour and the next colour is right next to it.
Yeah.
Right. But they're not. They're black lines. And they couldn't understand why that was. They just didn't make any sense. It's again as if light came in sort of bits. But the other big issue was something called the photoelectric effect. Because up until then, everybody that had any sense and anybody that understood science knew that light was a wave. You know, light, if you shine a light at things, the light goes round it like water would wave round something. You know, they could play around with light to prove it was a wave. But there were certain things that light did they couldn't understand. If you shone a beam of photons onto a surface, it will kick out electrons. Electrons get kicked out as if kind of little hard balls are hitting and kicking them out. And this was a great mystery till Einstein came along in 1905 and said, yeah, the reason it's doing that is simple. Light is made of tiny little particles. And the little particles are hitting and kicking them out. And everybody said, you idiotic person, how can that be? Light is a wave. We know it's a wave. And Einstein said, aha, it's both. Sometimes it's a wave and sometimes it's a particle. And of course, many years later, they discovered the existence of photons and it was given a name of photons, which were these little point particles.
That with the double slit experiment.
And then we get to the double slit experiment, which of course is part of that. And we still don't understand how light can be a particle and a wave at the same time. So all these things that the surety of Michelson and his predecessors were blown out the water. There was this whole area of science that they were completely and utterly unaware of, but the clues were there. And I think we're at that stage now. The clues are here for us. Dark matter, dark energy, how consciousness arises out of the brain, telepathy, all the sensations you had, the near-death experiences. All of these are screaming out to us. Hey guys, just look at what the information is telling you. Don't turn around and say, I do not accept this happens because my science cannot explain it, because that's what they do. It is simply somebody has a precognition, for example, and there will be all these tortuous explanations as to how a precognition can be the law of large numbers, it can be all kinds of things, but ultimately it is not what the person believes it to be. And this is bad science. You should go where the information tells you and try to find alternative explanations for something rather than just pretend it doesn't happen. Because by doing that, you are just, it's not science, it's scientism. And that's different. Scientism is a belief system. And if anything contradicts your belief system, you ignore it. And that's what a lot of materialist reductionist scientists do now. If it doesn't fit in, they simply ignore it. And then they get aggressive. Then they get insulting. Then there's ad hominem attacks and everything else. You know, in the medieval period, the medieval schoolmen existed in a scientific paradigm called Aristotelianism. And Aristotle's theory was that the Earth is the centre of the universe, it is flat and it doesn't move, and everything else revolves around it. The problem they had was that most planets, the wandering stars, went round seemingly in a circle, and they went round in the right way. But there were two planets that didn't. That was Mercury and Venus, and they seemed to go round for a time, and then they went back on themselves. And in order to explain this, the scientists of the day turned around and said there are things called epicycles, where they go round themselves. To actually keep their belief system correct, they created new hypothetical sciences and then did the maths. And they continued doing that until Newton came along, until Copernicus and Kepler, and then Newton came along. And then suddenly there was a new science. And we're exactly that point now.
Now, you brought up precognition, as you say. I say precognition.
You knew I was going to do that, didn't you?
Oh, well, I did. You know, I've had two very clear, well, many actually, but two crystal clear experiences of that when I was younger, in a nutshell, both involving contests. When I was about 17 in Canada, there was on the radio a contest that said win a trip for two to Miami and you'll go to Orlando, which I always get confused if it's Disneyland or Disney World there, but one of those. And I was like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. The contest was held at a chain of bars in Ottawa, Canada called Ralph's Bar. But as soon as I heard the radio announcement, I knew I was going to win the contest. And there were 700 names in the hat all over Ottawa in the bars. Sure enough, they drew mine and I won and got to go to Florida. And it was just crystal clear. I knew as soon as I heard it, oh, you're going to win that. Just make sure you go to the bar. So that was one incident. And then the other one, again with a contest on the radio, said we're going to be giving away $300 cash if you speed dial in. Well, I think I was even younger for this one, like 16. I didn't even have my own phone. And certainly this was way before cell phones. And I immediately knew you're going to win that, but you've got to get a phone that speed dials. So I we had Zellers in Canada at the time, which is now closed up. And the phone was really expensive. At the time, it was like $169, but it had speed dial. Had it installed in the garage, which was where my mum was the only place she'd let me put a phone in. And I put it in the garage because I was spray painting in the garage. And sure enough, I call in the radio and I win. And I win the $300. But I already knew I was going to win, both instances of precognition. This leads me to something in your book. After my experience, this continues to this day, by the way. I have little bits of knowings, is all I can call them, that come to me. A lot came after the experience. I would just know things or have very deep insights, and they still come to me. And one of them is a few months back, we were driving in the UK, and I was the passenger because I don't drive over here. It was sunny, and the sun was coming through leaves, through trees, and the light was dapperly. And I had this deep knowing, there's something to this. Write this in your book when you get home. There is something to dapperly light. And I felt that dapperly light, like you would see through the trees with the sun, can cause an altered state of consciousness that could allow you to perceive other things, such as the future. So I wrote it down in my book. This dapperly light is what I called it, Natalie's dapperly light theory. And I find in your book two things. Not only this, this guy, Brian Gysin, writing about, he was in the south of France in 1958, driving by an avenue of trees, and he had this precognition with the flickery light coming through the trees. And then I read that Nostradamus, famously predicting the future, would look through his fingers at a flickering candle. So this now, it's like, I feel I've got hardcore backup to my personal theory that a series of flickery lights can trigger an altered state and possibly precognition.
Wow.
I'm writing your next book.
Absolutely. Wow, you were so animated there. You were in the groove.
I used my hands big time.
Absolutely.
I'm like Donald Trump up here.
Absolutely. God, you scare me. I'll tell you. I'll vote for you. You got my vote. You got my vote.
And add this to this, and I'm super animated now, as I'm aware. I'm like pointing at Anthony with my fingers. But this is, again, these little knowings that come to me. What if, okay, let's say all of this is a simulation. Even the light that is generated, the trees are generated from computer programming, from massive processing power. They're not actually random. They are patterns. What if our designers designed a little backdoor unlock code to our consciousness, and that was a sequence of flickering light?
Which, of course, it could be, because it could be read digitally, because, of course, that's how flickering light works, and that's how holograms work, how lasers read.
Like barcodes.
Like barcodes, yeah.
Gotta say first.
Absolutely, like. So here we have, it could be very, very true that there could be something here, because Gysin devised a machine like a record deck with a kind of a cylinder that sat on a record deck with a light in the middle.
I'm making one with a can of Coors Light.
You don't need to. You don't need to. You can get hold of these light machines. Yeah, no, there's the Lucia light machine, which was invented by two associates of mine in Austria called Dr. Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Dirk Prokol. Dirk Prokol is a consultant neurologist, and Winkler is a consultant psychologist, I should say. And they have something called the Lucia, which can bring about altered states of consciousness. There is also another machine that's in the UK at the moment, which is considerably cheaper than Lucia, that is called, and its name escapes me now, but you can check it out. It's in the UK. So these light machines are there, and they can generate, as I say, what I call Cliver or Clover-form constants, which are lattice-like imagery. And of course, people who have migraine will argue that they see these things as well. It's as if it kind of starts to break down the visual field in some way to see beyond. But of course, we know that shamans for years would sit in front of flickering fires. I have seen children doing this. I spent last year, for 18 months, working at a school for children who had autism and epilepsy. And I'd see children on summer's days sitting down, putting their hands in front of their fingers, the fingers in front of their eyes, to actually reproduce the flicker effect in order to give themselves seizures.
Wow.
Now, if this is the case, and seizures are supposed to be really horrible, to the children who have the seizures, sometimes they can be extremely pleasant, because there was a very famous statement made. Well, it's not that famous, but hopefully because it was cited in one of my books, it's become more famous, is there were two French writers called Émile and Jules Goncourt. And Goncourt was once asked about the intensity of his seizures. And he turned around and he said, "My seizures have told me that life is a nothing between two epileptic seizures." And also Dostoevsky, in the book The Idiot, Dostoevsky's idiot character is Prince Myshkin. And Myshkin is talking to one of his friends, and Myshkin turns around and says, "I would give all my life for that sensation I have just before I go into a seizure, because then I perceive everything."
Wow.
And again, in the book, the second level after migraine, in my book, of people who can open the doors of perception naturally are people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, who experience temporal lobe epilepsy. And of course, we know there's photo triggers that, you have epilepsy, a flickering light can trigger the epileptic seizure. So there is a direct link between the flickering of light and the opening of certain neurological pathways in the brain that seem to bypass the Bergsonian ideal, the reducing engine of Bergson and everything else. It seems that light here is somewhere quite crucial. But of course, if everything is electromagnetic energy, when it really comes down to it, light will be crucial. But your coding of the idea that is kind of the trip code, is very, very interesting. I think you have something there, because there must be something that will break through.
I feel, and again, a lot of, obviously it's no good to science because it's feelings like how my experience, I felt that it was the truth. And these, for about five or 6 days afterwards, in the middle of the night between 3 and 4 a.m., I would wake up and I'd have these downloads of information that was so random to my life knowledge. And I'd write them down on Post-it notes. An example of one was, we are misdiagnosing schizophrenics. They are perceiving more of what is out there. We shouldn't be medicating them. We should be learning from them how they are perceiving things that we're not. And this sort of thing, all scientific things, one of them was the nature of time, that our time is very, very slowed down. And I would see visuals for this, like I saw all the stages of a paper falling. I could see all the different points in its space that it was falling, and then a drop of water with the water spreading out, a little ripple, but going so slowly. And the messaging was that it was our time is moving very slowly. And then when we're at the end of our life and we're out of this life, our life was in fact a snap. And this was all information that was coming to me. And what was it we were just talking about? There was the other one. Oh, yeah, the flickering light. The light, yeah. And I felt as well that why do these sort of sages and stuff and psychics, why do they light candles? Why do people meditate and stare in a flickering flame? Again, I feel, why do monks have a little candle burning? I feel there's something with the flickering that's able to dissipate the distraction that our consciousness has, simmer off all the media that's in our brains and let it go, distill it so that we can realize what's actually there. That's how I feel. But of course, I don't have science to back that up.
That is excellent, you know, and it one of the major problems, I think. Well, it's not a problem. I think for me, if this life, we are embodied within whatever this is in order to learn, in the final analysis, it's for Natalie to learn. It's for you to discover, by whatever route there is, to understand whatever you need to understand. Because I've always thought that my writing, I share my writing with other people. My writing is purely Anthony Peake's search for understanding. That I write books and I have the opportunity to write books which enables me to pull my ideas together. But I'm exactly the same as everybody else. You know, we're searching. There is in German philosophy, and I can never remember the German term for it, and I think it was Martin Heidegger, turned around and said that we are thrown into life. In other words, we don't choose to be here. We just find ourselves here. We become self-aware after a certain time as a baby, an embryo and a baby. We suddenly become dimly aware of the fact we are in this place that we never chose to be. And it's here around us, and we have to understand it. And it has mysteries and it has curiosities. I saw something yesterday on the BBC website that really upset me and really concerned me. And I think it will probably stay with me for the rest of my life because I saw it. Some guy's daughter, a 4-year-old daughter, had died in absolute agony with a form of cancer. Oh. And they couldn't give her painkillers or anything, and she was in agony. And he took a series of photographs of this little child screaming in agony.
God.
And she died 2 or 3 days ago. And the look of absolute agony on her face, it will haunt you forever. If you look at this photograph, you will never, ever forget it. This is not a kind of a fiction on TV and a kind of a soap opera where somebody dies. This was a genuine child screaming in agony.
How could they have not given her morphine or something?
It wasn't sufficient, apparently. The pain that you have with this particular form of cancer is so excruciating. Because, of course, what happens with morphine is it wears off, doesn't it? You know, the more you have of it, the less effective it becomes. But it's a harrowing photograph. Oh. And as he said, that she is now out of it. She's now at peace. And she was so brave in dealing with this. But because of this photograph, he's raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for research into this particular form of cancer. So it was good. But it makes you then think, well, why does this world exist for a child to be born and live for 4 years and die in agony? And you think, there cannot be a just God for that to happen. But if that child was that child's only ever life, and that's all she ever knew was pain and agony, what was the point of that? And the only thing I can think of is that within the program, within the multiverse, that there are other versions of her life where she didn't have the cancer and she grew up and she had children and she had a perfect life. Because otherwise you just want to give up and say, geez, it's all just cruel, it's all just nasty, and there is no point or reason to it. But I genuinely believe there is. But we have to get over that issue of why that is. And it's something called theodicy. There is a term in theology as to why pain and suffering occur. And it's quite an interesting one. It's that the God that created this world is not the real God. And the God that created this world, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, is a twisted being that thinks he's God that isn't. And a true God, the God behind God, wouldn't create pain. But
there's so many different points of view on this particular topic. My take on it for where I'm at in my life post having that experience, especially with the perception of time that I felt I was given, and I even saw a visual of when you play a song, there's the little equalizer graph. that with the little green
yes.
spikes, that our life is so short it wouldn't even show up on one tiny single spike in an equalizer graph, and that entire civilizations might be a couple of spikes in a song. And I felt that coming into this life, it's an experience, and we're choosing to come into the experience. And people might say, well, why would you ever choose? This is a tough one. I mean, what I'm going to say, it's a tough one. But this is my current, how I feel about things. Why would you choose to come in and die a horrible death? Now, my answer to that is, if you're out of this body and out of this life, and you know that really it's a snap. Why do we go to a scary movie? We want to be scared. Why do we go bungee jumping? We want to feel the feeling that we could die.
Yes.
That's why we go for a bungee jump. You want to be almost killed.
Well, it's almost the idea, isn't it? When you are in life-threatening experiences, you feel more alive than you ever could do normally.
It's an experience.
Yes.
This is why people skydive. They jump out of a plane.
Well, of course, this then comes back, to the concept of pain itself. Pain, if there were no creatures that had nerves and brains to process the sensation, pain would not exist. Pain does not exist. People, when I say this to people, people say, don't be ridiculous. Pain does exist because you feel it. Well, no, it's created by the brain. It is a brain-created sensation. Because if it wasn't, where is it? For instance, when I was a kid, I could never understand if I had I'd banged my leg or something, or hit my knee, and I had a pain in my knee, and I'd take some aspirin and the pain would go away. And I'd think, how does my brain know that I've injured my knee?
Right.
And of course it doesn't. What happens is this stuff goes into the brain, and it actually plays around with the chemicals in the brain to make you not feel pain. So a chemical can take pain away like that. Right. And it takes it away because it's a sensation. It's not real. It feels real. And it's when I always say to people when I do my talks, and I say, think about what is it that's unpleasant about pain? And it's very difficult. When you start to think that, you think, well, it's not nice.
Right, it's horrible.
Well, but why is it not nice? What is there about pain that isn't nice? And then we get a real problem. Because you can't define what is unpleasant about it. You just know it is. It's just an incredibly awful sensation. But could you explain to somebody who has never experienced pain, where would you even start to explain to somebody that, say, had that problem where pain doesn't exist in their body? Well, what does it feel like? I remember many years ago hearing a phrase, and another qualia, of course, is sight and colour. And I remember a blind child who'd been born blind asking her mother what colour was the wind. And it brings it home to you there that she had no concept of what colour was, but colour was something that imbued everything. She just knew there was something called colour that everything had. But she had no idea and way of conceptualising that in any way. But it was physical, so she went outside and she felt the wind blowing in her face. It's a physical something. It must have colour. Impossible.
Is that your phone?
That's my phone.
You can go get it.
Okay.
Yeah. The simulation just interrupted us with a program, a mod.
I don't know if you noticed my phone, the ringtone.
What was your ringtone now?
The ringtone is the verse from Crosby, Stills and Nash song Deja Vu. Oh. We have all been here before. We have all been here before.
Oh, that's funny. I've got the wombling theme.
The wombling theme. The Wombles of Wimbledon Common.
Wombles of Wimbledon Common. Oh, that one.
My last contract, I was actually across the road from Wimbledon Common. Used to try and see if I could find any Wombles, and there didn't seem to be any.
Those are in another universe, the Wombles.
Absolutely.
Well, I've got a note that's bizarre, but it's from your book, and it's really just about the idea that our brain produces DMT, this that gives the hallucinations, and that they'd done the experiments on rats. which I couldn't help but think of what little hallucinations rats would have, and they found it, I guess they had to kill the rats, which is a bit of a shame, to discover that there was DMT in their pineal gland, and they found it in their retina.
Yes. It's been known for a long time that DMT is in the retina. There was nothing new about that.
Wow.
And of course, because the retina is technically part of the brain anyway. So the retina is effectively part of the brain.
Okay.
And its structure is very, very similar. But the discovery of DMT within the brain of a live animal really is a game changer, because that explains the existence of something called the trace amine-associated receptors, which were discovered by Cozy, I think, sometime around about 10 or 11 years ago, and they made no sense. They're receptor sites in the brain. But if you look at them and realize that they are designed to work with dimethyltryptamine, and suddenly it makes sense. There's something else called sigma-1 and sigma-2 receptors that have been a great mystery. So it's starting to come together now. And Rick Strassman has said that his research has led him to believe that DMT is our reality modulator. This is our interface with the program in some way.
I'm literally just pausing.
Mike.
Yeah. So the DMT is a neurotransmitter.
Yeah, the evidence is that it is a standard neurotransmitter, and there are scores of neurotransmitters in the brain, and they can normally predict how a certain neurotransmitter will be chemically because of the structure of the receiver sites, the receptor sites. And it is also known that DMT is it's known that it's very, very similar to a substance called melatonin, and melatonin is produced by the pineal gland. So there are massive links here. And indeed, an associate of mine called Beach Barrett, who lives in Asheville in North Carolina, he's been researching this for quite a few years, and he calls endogenous, that is internally generated DMT, metatonin, which is above, and he's doing some fascinating research in that area.
Is there a way we can make ourselves make it?
Well, that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
I mean, again, with the light, some sort of light flickery
Well,
thing.
I believe that the light flickering stimulates it. And in my book, The Infinite Minefield, I had a whole section on how it could be that these flickering effects stimulates the pineal gland, because, of course, the pineal gland is an ossified eye. The pineal gland sits just above the optic nerve, and it is light sensitive. It has to be light sensitive because, of course, melatonin is the chemical that makes us go to sleep. So therefore, the pineal gland has to be aware of what the light is like outside. Of course, it's right in the centre of the brain.
Yeah, how can it even do that?
Because it sits above the optic nerve, and because it can sense signals going down the optic nerve, and it knows the signals, and there's light stimulation going on. And when the light stimulation starts to drop off, it realises it's going dark, and then it says, oh, it's going dark now, I've got to start releasing melatonin.
To make us go to sleep.
To make us go to sleep.
I believe in lizards, they actually have a little eye in the head, right?
They do.
Do people have that?
There's been a long argument. The lizard in question is a Chutara, and it's a lizard found off certain islands off New Zealand. And you can see on the Chutara, you can see the third eye, the ossified third eye.
I mean, why would a lizard have an eye in its head?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting point as to why it just seems that the pineal gland has not moved backwards into the head at that time. Which is curious in itself. But the pineal gland is very strange in that in earlier animals, it has a lens. And it also generates something called pineal sand, which are very, very tiny crystals. And I was intrigued when you were talking about crystals earlier on, because the pineal sand itself suggests that the pineal gland is piezoelectric. Because, of course, piezoelectricity works with crystals. So it can generate its own electrical field. So there's the explanation in many ways of what you were talking about earlier on about the generation of electricity. Because piezoelectricity is generated by these structures within the pineal gland. So again, we're coming down to some very, very interesting ideas of what the role of the pineal gland is. Now, the concept of the third eye, it goes right back through history, is the idea of people putting marks on the centre of their forehead and everything else. In the book, The Infinite Minefield, I discuss certain groups of individuals. There's a belief system called Kashmiri shavism, where I think they wear special hats to protect the pineal gland from sunlight.
Wow.
And these beliefs go back, millennia. You know, these are things that just go back so far. The cult of the pineal gland goes back centuries, century after century. There's been this interest with the pineal gland. Funnily enough, when Dr. Winkler and Dr. Procol first invented the Lucia machine, they took the Lucia machine off to Tibet, to Lhasa, because they wanted to test the machine with adepts of what's called dream yoga. Dream yoga is a form of Buddhism that comes out of the Bon tradition, and the Bon tradition is the kind of shamanic version of Buddhism. And with them was Professor Erlander Haraldsson of the University of Iceland, professor of psychology. And they went over there and they tested the Lucia light machine with monks. And the monks said that the Lucia light machine was able to bring about the same states of altered states of consciousness in them in 5 or 10 minutes that it takes 20 years of actually working with
I so
techniques.
want one of these gadgets.
Well, you know, I can arrange for you if you want to go over and see the guys. They're more than happy to do this. But going back, they went over and, as I say, the adept said it was quite amazing, the sensation it brought about. And it brought about an amazing sensation in me.
Is this where you saw, like, the galaxy and you kind of wimped out?
That's the one.
Yep.
That's the one. It's where I saw the astral plane. That's the one.
And it freaked you out?
It freaked me out so much. I've never experienced anything like it. But that's me being a coward.
You had the opposite of a Batman moment.
Yeah, that would be Nam. Would it be? No.
Yeah, I remember that from your other episode.
Yeah,
you saw a galaxy appearing.
No, I saw a planet. I was flying over this, hovering over the surface of a planet. But suffice to say, the reason that what happened to them intrigued me was that they spent a couple of days in one of the palaces there, and one evening, afternoon, I don't know when it was, but they took themselves off wandering down the corridors, and they found a room, and they went inside the room, and there were these huge glass cases, and inside the glass cases were these what looked like huge white stones, and they looked at them further and realised they were ossified pineal glands. And,
like human ones?
Elephants. These were elephants.
Oh, elephants,
pineal
elephants.
glands. They were different animals. Pineal glands are little different elephants. And nobody could explain why they had been collecting them, because these cases were centuries old.
Wow.
And again, it would be something you could talk to the good doctors about, that as to the more of that experience.
Wow.
Because I've cited that many times, and it would be interesting again to get it confirmed.
Isn't it some of the theories of why we've got in history some of these elongated skulls of Egyptians and different ancient peoples, that they were stretching the skulls out to allow the pineal gland to grow bigger?
I don't know. But I know that there are parallels between sacred geometry and the pineal gland, because the layout of some of the buildings in Egypt are quite precise. And for instance, an associate of mine called Patricia Awan, who runs the Kemet School of Archaeology in Egypt, she told me that, or she pointed out something to me that I'd never realised before. She was talking about the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. And she said, "Have you ever thought about the name pyramid?" And she said, "I think you know a little Greek, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "So translate what pyramid means."
Ooh, I love a puzzle.
Pyramidus, fire in the middle.
Oh.
And she said, it's the pineal gland. And she said, it's symbolic of the pineal gland, as is the caduceus. You know, where you have
Is that the medical
snakes.
symbol, right?
The two snakes going up. They are what's called the Ida and the Pingala, which are the channels of the Kundalini that go up the spine. And then when they get to the top, if you look, the two snakes come together. You have open mouths, and then you have two wings and a disc. The wings are the two hemispheres of the brain, and the disc in the middle is the pineal gland.
Ooh.
It's hiding in plain sight. Not only this, but this is a symbol that's been used by Masonic traditions for centuries. The Masons known about this. Wow. The Masons have known about the pineal gland for since the year dot. It is central to their belief system. So the pineal gland here, clearly there is something far more to it. Now, one could reasonably argue that the only reason we have any real interest in the pineal gland is that effectively it is the only non-bisected thing in the brain. So, for instance, if you took the top off somebody's head, I wouldn't advise it. But if you took the top off the skull, you'd see the two hemispheres of the brain.
Right.
If you pull the two hemispheres apart, you would actually see the corpus callosum, which is the thing that holds the two sides together. And sitting right in the middle of the brain is a tiny pea-shaped object. It's the only one. Because underneath it, there are 2 hippocampi, there are 2 amygdala, there are 2 hypothalamus and various other things, but the only one that isn't is the pineal gland, and it sits completely central and on its own.
It seems like it's the key.
Yes. I believe it is the key, and I believe there is strong evidence that not only is the key, but there is actually there is neurological evidence for it as well. For example, again, this is through the research of this friend of mine, Beach Barrett. Beach has researched this quite a lot, and it seems that I've done a bit more on it to actually add meat to it, is that on the 49th day of gestation, the pineal and pituitary body are a single body and they sit at the back of the throat. So the 49th day of gestation, as the baby develops, they sit at the back of the throat.
Wow.
At the 49th day, they start to move from the back of the throat to the centre of the brain. 49th day is intriguing in itself because the 49th day is when the Buddhists believe that consciousness and the soul enters the body. Up until then, there isn't anything. It's at that point when the pineal gland starts to move. It moves up to the centre of the brain over a period of weeks, and there it moves, it splits into 2 to the pineal and the pituitary gland. It leaves in the back of the throat something called Rathke's pouch, R-A-T-H-K-E, Rathke's pouch, which is a kind of a little duct that runs down to the back of the throat. All this is for a reason, because there is a technique that is used by Indian mystics called the Kakara Mudra. And the Kakara Mudra is training yourself to actually be able to place your tongue at the back of your throat.
Oh.
And the reason they do that is that if you do that and you go into deep meditative states, or to facilitate deep meditative states, you taste something called the nectar of transcendence, or the sublime nectar. The sublime nectar is an acidic taste at the back of the throat. I believe that acidic taste is DMT, and I believe what is happening is the pineal gland is creating DMT, and it's dripping down Rathke's pouch, and it drips down to the back of the throat. That's why they do Kakara Mudra. This is really fascinating stuff, and I've spoken to adepts and people who train, and they said, yep, I've had that taste. Whenever I do talks now, and there are people there who do meditation and deep meditation, I will ask them, have you ever had that taste in the back of your throat?
Yeah.
The vast majority of them will know say they knew exactly what I'm talking about. It's DMT.
With your rats and the DMT, it also, you said that the rats had brain activity after they were dead.
Correct. Yeah,
so
around
how
about
does
8 to 10 seconds. This is work by a lady called Jimo Borgigian at the University of Michigan. And she did both experiments. She did the experiments finding the DMT. I think the guy she worked with, I always forget to mention him as well, which I think is very unfair. But obviously his name has not really stuck inside my
It's
brain.
like you don't mention anyone in these interviews. All of the people you overlook who must be going, why doesn't he say my name?
Why doesn't he say me? Absolutely. Which is
You're like an almanac of everyone.
of everyone I've ever met. Don't meet me, I'll regurgitate your information at some time in the future. But Jimo did this work with rats, and they then killed the rats, and then there was a spike of brain activity after the rat had died. And this has been concluded to be evidence of the near-death experience, and the idea that there is a kind of a stimulation technically after we are technically brain dead. And of course, there's this big issue as to exactly where death occurs. And again, if anybody's interested in this, there's a book called The Lazarus Effect, written by a medical doctor whose, again, names escape me, but it will be worth checking out, because this is the whole thing of the leading research as to when death is, because it seems to be a transition rather than an instant time in terms of this. So this kind of period of death could be longer than after brain death, in which case this brain activity could be part of that. But they argue that it is evidence of the near-death experience, and that it is just the dying brain or the dead brain doing its final kick before it goes. And this has been grasped by a lot of individuals trying to disprove the near-death experience, saying that, well, this proves that the near-death experience is just brain activity. To me, no, it doesn't. To me, it proves, A, that something can happen in a dead brain, which is technically impossible, but also it says to me, right, so at death, or at the point of death, or just after death, we are still aware of something. Now, because time perception is relative, effectively that split second in the brain could be for relative to the person involved, could be a lifetime. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, because time, again, quick experience, fainted when I was 16.
Sam Parnia, by the way, is the doctor. Sam
Okay.
Parnia. Okay.
But with time, as you say, they wouldn't have the perception.
And it's Steve Barker is the guy I forgot his name of. The other
Steve.
guy. Sorry. Steve, sorry about that. Sorry.
All right, quit writing your letter of complaint, Steve. He remembered you. But the time, as you say, it could have been their whole life. And I know from fainting, which I've fainted a few times through my life, I felt like I've been out for hours. I've had entire journeys that have happened, and I come back and they say I literally fell back and came forward again. It was a split second, but the perception of time. So I'm sure that would happen as well.
In my first book, I do the neurology of this. I think it's related to the release of something called glutamate in the brain. And glutamate is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. And it is known that glutamate is what brings about the sensation of time slowing down during times of stress. So therefore, when people are in car crashes, they seem to have time to drive around everything. And it's a known effect. Now, I have evidence that this takes place at the point of death, and it definitely takes place during near-death experiences. So it is quite reasonable that time could dilate to such an extent that you could relive your whole life again in that final seconds of life. And you could live multiple lives in those final seconds because, of course, time is relative. Time is a subjective experience, just like pain is. Time is one of the great mysteries of everything. I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time a few years ago, trying to discuss the philosophy and science of the perception of time. And, a moment's reflection, and even using a term, a moment's reflection, shows how much our language is embodied in time, is that it's the only thing I know that is measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples, and what you do is you cut your apples and you weigh them. Or, the length of a car is 6 or 7 feet or whatever, or so many yards. But you can only ever measure time by itself. You can only ever have a minute of a minute or a second of a second. But if somebody's perceiving a second differently to the way a second is traveling in time, that second could be forever. A guy called Erickson did a series of experiments a few years ago on time perception in people who are in deep hypnotic states. And these people could do amazing things within a split second.
Right.
One of them was counting balls of wool. And they had a lady whose job was counting balls of wool. And she was able to, in a hypnotic state, imagine herself counting. And she counted something like 200 balls of wool in about 6 seconds. And she said, no, I definitely counted them.
I wonder if this is how David Blaine does his tricks. Have you seen any of his specials?
No.
They're incredible. He just had one out called, I think it was Beyond Magic. And he'll have somebody like chuck a deck of cards at him. And it's as though, well, he has the perception of the entire deck of cards and can know which card has fallen where. And, look that up, because I've watched a few of his specials and really thought, this guy he's not just doing a trick here. He's doing something like to do with hypnosis. He's doing some mindy thing that's giving him a bigger perception, or that's changing the perception of his subjects that he's doing the tricks with. It's uncanny. I'd love to know what you think of his performances.
Very much so, because a lot of the top illusionists clearly are applying NLP and various other forms of mind control in order to make people think and do certain things. And we know that is possible. Slowing down time, if you had an ability to do that, you could certainly be very, very powerful in terms of the things you could could work with. I have heard, for instance, when I did a talk for the Society for Psychical Research a few weeks ago, and again I mentioned I was in discussions with Professor Bernard Carr. I was discussing with Bernard Carr and a friend of mine called Steve Balsamo, who's a rock musician. And the three of us were discussing this, and Steve was telling me that he had heard that there are certain drugs that they're trying to develop in America, whereby somebody who has been given a prison sentence of, say, 50 years, they can administer drugs that person will perceive 50 years in 5 years.
Good grief.
And as we were saying, God, is that morally right?
Isn't the point the punishment?
Exactly. And that was exactly the point we were making. And I meant to actually check up on this.
Wow.
Because this again shows how subjective time perception is.
But wouldn't it also then work if they can do that? They can give you a pill that will make your 5 years feel like 50 years, which for terminally ill patients, for example, they could experience a great life in a matter of days.
The problem is then, though, that how that will work, there's something called Zeitrapper's syndrome, like the Zeitrapper syndrome, which was discovered in Germany when a guy had been discovered driving, I think, down the motorway really slowly. And the police stopped him. And he said that, as far as he was concerned, he was traveling at 90 miles an hour. And life was just going so fast, he wanted to slow it down. He couldn't. It was just going too fast. And they did some tests on him, and he had some form of brain tumor. And he died about 3 or 4 weeks later.
Wow.
And they said this is very, very peculiar, because he swore that suddenly time had just bombed by.
Right.
To such an extent that he was living his life at a great speed. Now, if somebody is perceiving that, from our point of view, they don't talk any quicker. They don't seem to be moving any quicker, but they seem to be perceiving things quicker. Now, what is going on there in the brain? And again, is this something to do with time itself? And I genuinely don't know. It's like precognition. If you were able to fall out of time, or you were able to perceive your immediate future, you would be precognitive. You would be, because there are people who permanently déjà vu. There are individuals, and this is where things become very interesting. There are people who are what's called senile. I think it's called Alzheimer's-related persistent déjà vu, and these are people who have Alzheimer's who are permanently in déjà vu state. Now, again, what is going on here? What is happening with the brain? Why is the brain doing this?
Well, if we're all sort of biological computers, which we kind of are, let's face it, we're just doing a lot of processing in our body. Yes. We're conscious. But if you really look at what our body is doing, they're like supercomputers. They're just multi-processing all over, doing repairs, virus scanning and this kind of stuff. Well, if you malfunction, it makes sense to me that your perception of time would absolutely be altered. And especially having had the fainting experiences repeatedly where, from the low blood pressure, I fainted and I felt like I've been out for hours and it's been a snap. How did that happen?
Yeah, somebody mentioned this to me recently when I was in one of my talks, and they said you need to look into low blood pressure. Because of the time dilation effects. So you're the second person that's mentioned,
Yeah, you can study me and my low blood pressure.
Okay. But then again, you do have the issue that these are things we do need to start getting empirical evidence for, because I know that the cynics out there and the critics out there will say, you need proof of these things, because they'll argue, and they always say the proof of anecdote is not proof. The plural of anecdote is not proof. Well, no, it isn't. But so many people have these experiences that how many people have to have these experiences before we start to say, well, there's something in it.
Yeah, if there's multiple incidents, it's at least a clue.
Yes. Wake up, guys. Come on. Stop playing around and saying the law of large numbers. When, somebody I know, a guy, for instance, an associate of mine, had a dream where he saw, in the dream, he was in a hotel. He knew it was abroad. He knew it was in the winter. And he knew he was on the outskirts of an airport. And he looked out of the hotel window, and as he did so, he saw Concorde fly past with its tail on fire. He saw it crash, and as it crashed, he heard people come through his body, souls come through his body, speaking to each other in German.
Wow.
He was so disturbed by this, he sent a fax to British Airways to say a Concorde is going to crash soon. It's going to be in a foreign airport. The passengers are going to be German.
Oh, dear.
Okay? They, of course, ignored him, because they would. They get crank calls all the time. Of course, 6 or 7 months later was the Paris air crash. In the Paris air crash, the Concorde crashed in the autumn or in the winter with its back on fire. Planes that had never, ever crashed ever. This was the first and only ever crash of Concorde at the time. And the passengers were German.
Oh, boy.
Now, I've put this forward many, many times, and people have turned around to me and argued and said, statistics, law of large numbers, micro-dreaming. He had a dream of an air crash. Get over it. It was a coincidence. Okay, if he'd had seen a plane crashing and a few days later a plane crashes in India, that's a coincidence. If I have a dream of Concorde with its back on fire in a hotel, in a foreign airport with its back on fire with German passengers, I'm thinking, statistically, this is pretty unique.
Yeah, that's right. The odds are probably billions to one of that.
And do you know the fallback position then is? He made it up. Well, we have the facts.
Wow.
So, there's another friend of mine, Graham Nichols, Out of the Body Experiencer. I don't know if I mentioned this last time we spoke. The guy that was on a training course and he fainted, blacked out, and he found himself in a jungle. And he could feel the heat around him and everything else. And he's walking through the jungle and he steps out, parts the plants, steps out, and he's in a corner of Wardour Street and Old Compton Street in Soho, I think it was. He looks down the street, and as he does so, a young boy runs past him, and he felt the wind displace him to the air as the young boy walked past. He knew he was definitely there. As he was doing so, he could hear voices in the distance going, "Graham, Graham," and it was people in the room trying to bring him to. As he did so, he looked down the street, and there was an explosion in the middle of the street, and people were staggering out, covered in blood. This was 1999 in November, I think it was. 5th of November, I think, something like that, when he had the experience. He wakes up and he turns around to the people and he said, "I've just had a precognitive out-of-the-body experience. There's going to be a terrorist attack in London, in Soho soon." 5 days later, the Admiral Duncan pub was blown up in exactly the location he described. Exactly.
Wow.
And again, I have cynics saying, "Oh, made it up."
Right.
And that's the fallback position.
Right.
Made it up.
Well, I know we have to wrap up, although with you we could go on forever, but I know we have to let you go at some point. I wanted to ask you, as just my final question to you, about these energy balls that I saw, because you're so knowledgeable with both your research and your own theories. What's your best guess of what you think I saw?
I would like to suggest that you are probably seeing some form of pixelation of the reality thing, that you are seeing the breakdown of what reality really is, as if you're kind of looking at the underside, looking round the other side of the reality.
Like a close-up of an LED screen where you see all the little light bulbs?
Seeing the pixelation. Now, I know that Craig Hogan and his team have discovered the equivalent of the pixelation of this universe.
Wow.
So they've already done it. And again, if nobody takes my word for it, again, just read up Craig Hogan, because he's actually got a device where they're trying to find more details about the true nature of this reality. And again, the guy's name is Craig Hogan, and he's professor of physics or professor of astrophysics at the Perimeter Institute in the States. So I just believe that something, you got so close to it that you could see it. The question is, what stimulated you to be there? Was it a near-death experience whereby you were seeing more? Was there some kind of chemical imbalance in yourself? And then we have the million-dollar question. Chemicals are made of physical things, and it is chemicals that bring about something physical, i.e. the brain, perceiving the pixelation of the reality that the chemicals are part of themselves. So you end up almost getting yourself in really knots of what reality is and how deep this thing really goes. Because I've never experienced anything like that, but I know people who have. And I know that the people that do have these experiences tend to be consistent. And if you get a regular consistency of people having extraordinary experiences where they describe the same things in isolation from each other, we have to look into this. We can't just pretend it's not happening. And it's very, very sad, because we continue and our science continues along. And I'm the first to agree that materialist reductionist science has been incredibly productive. It really has. It's done so well. But it is not an explanator of total reality. And the reason it is not the explanator of total reality is something that most scientists do not want to hear. And this is a simple thing. There are two forms of understanding of reality we have at the moment: the quantum world and the big world of Einstein relativity. If the universe is a singular universe and we understand everything that's about it, the maths that we apply in the Einsteinian world should work with the maths we apply in the quantum world. They don't. So therefore, we have a problem. We have two versions of reality that mathematically are inconsistent. And the only answer to this is that at a deeper level of reality, there must be a consistent reality where maths and the physics works totally. And that is the reality we need to go down to. And we can only go down to that reality when we accept that we have a problem with this.
Right. We haven't got it right yet.
No.
Right. Well, all I can say is our ancestors, hello there, 200, 300 years in the future. I hope you're betting on this guy to figure out your scheme.
Oh, my God. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. But, hey, guys, don't. No. Don't say that at all.
We're now having a conversation, by the way, with ancestors, just
Absolutely.
for the listeners to be in on this.
Yeah.
Anthony, thank you so much again for taking... what's the perception of time? It again feels like we've been chatting half an hour, and it's been much more than half an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be plugging your book, and I hope we see you soon. There you go. Thank you again, Anthony Peake. As always, I'll post links at thegreyescape.com to stuff you might have heard about in this episode, as well as how you can learn more about the amazing work and research of Anthony Peake. So how are you guys feeling? Kind of pixelated? Kind of like you need a software update? I don't know. Boy, it makes you think. I mean, just the astronomical leaps in technology that have been made in the last 50 years. You know, you just imagine what it's going to be like in 500 years or 1,000 years in the future. So, hey, future ancestors, if you're listening right now, if you subscribed to this podcast, how about cutting us some slack down here? We have some stuff we'd like to get rid of. Starting with cancer, maybe run a virus scan and help us out a bit. While you're at it, maybe amend society so it's not dependent on money. You know, maybe make it that our world runs on a currency of niceness, of compassion. Yeah, it's time for Planet Earth, version 2016.2. That's a wrap, folks. I hope you've enjoyed these episodes. You can let me know at the Facebook page /The Grey Escape, at Twitter @ThatNatalieGray, or of course on the show's website, thegreyescape.com. And the show now has its own YouTube channel, The Grey Escape, so please feel free to share that with your peeps who may not be caught up to speed with the whole podcast technology. Okay, well, I'll be back soon with another great guest. You know, if I'm a computer simulation, I just hope I'm running on a Mac. All right, take care. I'll be back real soon, right here on The Grey Escape.